Some people are told they don't matter early enough that they almost believe it. Sienna Hale was one of them. Her own mother called her a worthless piece of trash in front of a full table of guests. She set the tray down, said nothing, and spent the next 12 years building something none of them saw coming. This is that story. Stay with me. For 9 years, my mother pointed at me in front of guests and said I was the family mistake. I never argued, I just kept working. She did not know I was keeping records. My name is Sienna Hale. I am 32 years old, and the night she called me a worthless piece of trash in front of a full dinner table, I was the one holding the appetizer tray. I set it down without dropping anything. That was the night I stopped waiting to be seen and started building something they would not be able to ignore. I was never meant to matter in that house. I was there to make someone else look better. I was standing at the edge of the room in a dress I had paid for myself, holding a tray that smelled like roasted chicken and expensive wine, the kind my mom only bought when people were watching. The lights were too bright, the silver was polished, the napkins were folded into perfect triangles, and I was the only thing in that room that did not fit the picture. My mom was laughing when she said it, leaning back in her chair, one hand wrapped around a glass of wine. She pointed at me like I was part of the entertainment. "Sienna," she said, "she is our little mistake." The table laughed. Someone actually slapped the table. Another woman covered her mouth, but she was smiling too. My mom tilted her head, pretending to be thoughtful. She said, "We tried with her, but not everyone turns out the way you hope. Some people are just not built for success." Then she turned toward my brother, sitting at the head of the table like he had already earned it. "Now him," she said. "That is what we were waiting for." More laughter, more agreement. My brother smiled, not embarrassed, not uncomfortable, just pleased. I stood there, holding that tray, feeling the weight of it press into my palms. I remember noticing stupid things. The way the air vent hummed softly above me. The way the wine in my mom's glass caught the light. The way my dad did not look at me at all. He just kept cutting his food, nodding along like this was normal, like this was how families talked. I set the tray down carefully because the last thing I was going to do was give them a reason to laugh harder. I moved around the table, placing plates, refilling glasses, doing everything I had been doing for years. Because this was not new. That was the part that hit me the hardest. It was not new. This was just louder. When I was 15, she had said something similar, only quieter, just to my aunt. "She is not like Grant," she said, almost whispering, like it was a secret. "He is driven. She just drifts." When I was 16, she laughed when I brought home a report card that was not perfect. She said, "Well, we cannot all be the smart one." And when I was 17, she started having these dinners more often. More people, more chances to show him off, more chances to use me as contrast. It was always the same structure. Praise him, lower me, smile while doing it so nobody could call it cruel. And I learned how to move quietly through it, how to carry plates, how to disappear in plain sight. That night was just the first time she said it out loud enough for everyone to hear. Worthless piece of trash. The words did not land like a slap, they landed like confirmation. I finished serving, then stood by the kitchen entrance, just out of the main circle, listening. They talked about my brother's business, about his plans, about how he was going to build something big. My mom leaned forward, her voice warm, proud. "We always knew he was going to be something," she said. Then she glanced at me again, almost as an afterthought. "And some people," she added, "they are just not what you needed." That sentence stayed with me longer than anything else. Not what you needed, not wrong, not bad, just unnecessary. Like I had been born into the wrong role and nobody had bothered to tell me. Dinner went on. Dessert was served. People complimented my mom on everything, the house, the food, her son. Nobody mentioned me. And honestly, I did not expect them to, because I had already started stepping back inside my own head, watching everything like it was happening to someone else. By the time the last guest left, the house was quiet again. The lights were still too bright. The dishes were still stacked in the sink. My mom walked past me without a word, heading upstairs. My dad followed a few minutes later, stopping just long enough to say, "Clean up before you go to bed." Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "That was too much." Just clean up. I washed every plate. I dried every glass. I wiped down the counters. Slowly, carefully. Like I had all the time in the world. Because something in me had already made a decision. I just had not said it out loud yet.
When I finished, I stood alone in the kitchen, listening to the silence. Then I walked upstairs to my room. It was small, nothing like my brother's, no new furniture, no upgrades. Just the same space I had grown up in. I closed the door behind me and sat on the edge of my bed. For a few seconds, I just stared at the wall. Then I reached for my laptop. 2 weeks earlier, I had checked my college fund for the first time. It was something my parents had always talked about. Do not worry, they would say. We have it covered. Tonight, I needed to see it again. Maybe to prove to myself that not everything they said was empty. I logged in, my hands were steady, too steady. The screen loaded, the numbers appeared. 0. Not low, not reduced, gone. I stared at it, waiting for my brain to catch up. I refreshed the page, same result. I checked the transaction history, there it was. A withdrawal from earlier that year. A large amount, everything that had been there. I sat there for a long time, not crying, not angry, just very, very clear. They had taken it, they had taken my future and used it for something else. And suddenly, everything else made sense. The dinners, the comments, the way they talked about my brother like he was an investment, because he was, and I was not. I closed the laptop slowly. I did not go downstairs. I did not wake them up. I did not ask for an explanation. Because I already knew what they would say. We did what we had to do. He needed it more. You will figure something out. You always do. That last one was their favorite. You always do. Like it was a compliment. Like it meant I was strong. But what it really meant was simple. You are on your own. I stood up and walked to my closet. I pulled out a backpack. Not a suitcase. Not anything that suggested I was coming back. Just something small. I packed 3 shirts, a pair of jeans, my work shoes, the envelope with the little cash I had saved. $83. I looked around the room once. There was nothing in it I could not live without. That realization hurt more than anything else. Not the words, not the money. The fact that I could leave and not miss a single thing. At 12:41 in the morning, I opened my window. Not the front door. I did not want to hear them. I did not want to risk them waking up and stopping me. Not because they cared, but because it would look bad. I climbed out quietly, dropped onto the grass, and stood there for a second. The neighborhood was silent. Perfect lawns. Soft lights on porches. Everything looked exactly the way it was supposed to. Except me. I adjusted the straps on my backpack and started walking. Past our driveway. Past the houses I had known my whole life. Past everything that had told me who I was supposed to be. I did not look back. Not once. Because I already knew what was behind me. A house where I had never really existed the way I thought I did. A family that had decided, a long time ago, that I was not the one they were building their future on. And for the first time in my life, I stopped trying to change that. I walked until the neighborhood ended, until the sidewalks turned into empty roads, until the air felt different. And somewhere along that walk, a thought settled in my chest, quiet and steady. If I stayed, I would disappear. So I kept walking. By the time the sky started turning that pale gray right before sunrise, my feet hurt, my shoulders ached from the weight of the backpack, and I had no real plan beyond not going back. Dallas felt different at that hour. Not quiet the way my old neighborhood was, but empty in a colder way. Gas stations buzzing with fluorescent lights, a few cars passing, people who looked like they had somewhere to be, and people who clearly did not. I stopped outside a convenience store and stood there for a minute, trying to decide if I looked like someone who belonged. Then I walked in anyway. The air inside smelled like burnt coffee and cleaning chemicals. A man behind the counter barely looked at me. That was the first time I realized how invisible I had become the moment I stepped out of that house. I bought the cheapest thing I could find, a small cup of coffee and a packaged muffin. I counted the money in my head twice before handing it over. $83 had turned into a number I could feel pressing against my chest. I sat outside on the curb and ate slowly, not because I wanted to, but because I did not know when I would eat again. That was the moment it really hit me. Nobody was coming to get me. Nobody was even going to notice I was gone until it became inconvenient for them. I finished eating, threw the wrapper away, and started walking again. By mid-morning, I found a used car lot on the edge of a busy road. It was not the kind of place people went to find something reliable. It was the kind of place people went when they had no other choice. That was exactly my situation. The owner barely looked at me at first, but when I told him how much I had, he pointed to a small, faded sedan parked in the back. It was not pretty. The paint was uneven, one headlight slightly dimmer than the other, and the interior smelled like something old that had never quite left. But it ran. That was all that mattered. I handed over almost everything I had. By the time I drove off that lot, I had less than $20 left, a car that might not last a month, and nowhere to go. I drove until I found a large parking lot behind a grocery store. It was busy enough that one more car did not stand out, but quiet enough that I could stay there for a while. That night, I slept in the driver's seat. I did not stretch out. I did not get comfortable. I just leaned back, wrapped my arms around myself, and closed my eyes. Every sound felt too loud. A car door slamming somewhere, a shopping cart rattling across the pavement, voices in the distance. I woke up every time something shifted. But I did not leave, because I had nowhere else to go. The next morning, I started looking for work. Not a career, not anything long-term, just something that would keep me moving. I got a job at a diner off the highway within a few days. The manager did not ask many questions. He just needed someone who could show up and not cause problems. I could do that. I worked early mornings, pouring coffee, wiping tables, learning how to smile when people barely looked at me. The tips were not great, but they were something. In the afternoons, I started picking up shifts at a small warehouse a few miles away. It was the kind of place that took anyone willing to lift boxes and stay quiet. The work was heavy, the pace was fast, and I was the only girl on the floor most days. They noticed, not in a helpful way, more like a test. At first it was small things, giving me the heaviest stacks, watching to see if I would complain. I did not. Then it got more obvious. One of the guys would stack things just slightly wrong, just enough to see if I would catch it before it fell. Another would walk by and say things under his breath, not loud enough to be reported, but loud enough to make sure I heard. I learned quickly, keep your head down, do the work. Do not give them anything to use against you, but that did not mean they stopped. The warehouse tested me every day in small ways that added up to one large certainty, and this place had already decided who I was, and nothing I did was going to change that. That night, sitting in my car, I pulled out a flyer I had grabbed weeks earlier from a bulletin board at the diner. Community college, evening classes, technical certifications. I had taken it without really thinking. Now I looked at it differently, not as an option, as a door. The problem was the cost. I had almost nothing. But I also had nothing to fall back on, which meant the risk was not as big as it felt, because there was nothing to lose. That night, sitting in my car, I pulled out a flyer I had grabbed weeks earlier from a bulletin board at the diner. Community college. Evening classes. I held it for a long time, then I put it in my bag and went to sleep. It was not impressive. Plain buildings, crowded hallways, people moving in and out without paying attention to each other. Perfect. I talked to an advisor who explained the programs, the costs, the options. Loans. That word sat heavy in my chest. Debt. Something I had been told to avoid my whole life. But the truth was, my whole life had been built on something I never had control over. Now, at least, this would be mine. I signed up. I did not celebrate. I did not call anyone. I just added it to the list of things I had to survive. Classes at night, diner in the morning, warehouse in the afternoon, sleep in between whenever I could. It was not balanced. It was not healthy, but it was movement. And movement was the only thing keeping me from falling apart. That was when Nolan first noticed me. He was not the kind of person who stood out. Mid-40s, quiet, always watching more than talking. He worked on the technical side, overseeing some of the projects connected to the program. The first time he spoke to me was after class one evening. "You are not slow," he said, looking at the work I had been struggling with. "You are just late." I frowned, not sure what he meant. "Late," he repeated. "Like you started running after everyone else already had a head start." He did not smile, he did not soften it, but he also did not dismiss me, which was new. Most people either ignored me or assumed I would not keep up. He just stated it like a fact. Then he added, "If you are going to catch up, you cannot afford to hesitate." That stuck with me. A few weeks later, he offered me a small opportunity. Not a job, not something stable, just a chance to assist on a minor project, basic tasks, nothing important. But it was something different. Something that moved me out of the loop I had been stuck in. I took it, of course I did. It did not pay much, it did not solve anything overnight, but it shifted something. For the first time since I left that house, I felt like I was moving towards something, not just away. That did not make things easier. If anything, it made the pressure heavier. Because now there was a direction, and failure had a shape. Every night I sat in that car or in a quiet corner of the campus, looking at my schedule, my bills, the numbers that never quite added up, the loan documents, the interest, the time, all of it stacked against me. But there was one thing I understood completely. I did not have a safety net. There was no backup plan, no one waiting to catch me if I slipped. And for the first time, I saw that clearly. Not as something unfair, not as something to resent, but as something absolute. I leaned back in the driver's seat one night, staring up at the dark ceiling of the car, listening to the faint hum of the parking lot lights. And the thought came, simple and solemn. I do not get to fail. That thought did not feel dramatic after a while. It just felt like physics, like gravity, like something that was simply true whether I accepted it or not. The warehouse smelled like dust and metal and something chemical I never learned the name of. I had been there long enough that I stopped noticing it, which was how I knew I had been there too long. Marcus was the one who watched me most closely, not the supervisor, not management, just Marcus, mid-30s, worked the east side of the floor, had been there long enough that he treated the place like it belonged to him. He was not loud about it. That was what made him effective. He did not need to be loud. He just needed to be first to speak whenever something went wrong. One afternoon, I was assigned to check incoming inventory against a digital list. The numbers did not match. I flagged it immediately, walked the clipboard to the supervisor, showed him the discrepancy. "Just keep moving," he said. "We do not have time to double-check everything." So I went back to work. The next day, the system flagged the same discrepancy, louder this time. Inventory was missing. Now it mattered. Now everyone had somewhere to look. The supervisor called me over. "You checked this," he said. I nodded. "Then why is it wrong?" "I told you yesterday," I said. My voice was steady. I had practiced that. He frowned. "I do not remember that." Marcus spoke up from behind me, not even turning around from what he was doing. "She is still figuring out the system," he said. "Give her time." That was all. Not an accusation, not a raised voice. Just 8 words that moved the weight of the room without anyone seeing it happen. I looked at the screen, then at the stack of boxes, then back at the supervisor. "Give me 10 minutes, I said. He shrugged. "Fine." I moved fast. Retraced the steps. Checked every label, every scan, every timestamp. And there it was, the original entry error. Pre-existing. Before I had touched anything. I pulled it up, showed him. He stared at it for a second. Then he said, "Fix it." No apology, no acknowledgement. Just the next instruction, delivered like the last 10 minutes had not happened. I fixed it. Alone. No one helped. After the shift, Marcus passed me near the exit. "Good catch," he said. "The same way you say it when you mean the opposite." I did not respond. Because I understood something now that I had not understood when I started. Being right did not matter here. What mattered was who said it first. I had been playing a game where the rules changed based on who was speaking, and no amount of accuracy was going to change that, because the game was not about accuracy. It was about position, and my position had been decided before I showed up. That night, I sat in the back row of my evening class, and for the first time since I had started, I could not focus on what was on the board. My mind kept going back to Marcus, to the supervisor, to the 8 words that had cost me nothing and everything at the same time. After class, Nolan stopped near my desk. "You are distracted," he said. "I am wasting time," I said. "That is one way to look at it. What is the other way?" He crossed his arms, thinking for a moment. "You are still choosing to stay somewhere that does not need you to grow." He did not elaborate. He did not need to, because it was true. I was surviving at the warehouse. But survival was not the same as movement. And every day I stayed in a place that had already decided who I was. I was spending time I did not have on a ceiling I was never going to break through. I drove home that night with the windows down, even though it was cold. Not because I wanted the cold, because I needed to feel something different than the air inside that building. At a red light, I caught my own reflection in the glass, and without meaning to, I heard her voice. Some people are just not built for success. She had said it lightly, warmly almost. 2. The way you say something you have believed for so long it no longer feels cruel, just accurate. I had been 15 the first time. I was sitting across from her in a kitchen that smelled like the same roasted chicken she made every time people were coming over, and she had said it to my aunt while I was still in the room. She's not like Grant. He is driven. She just drifts. Said the way you describe weather. Neutral. Factual. Not a judgment. An assessment. The light changed. I drove. And I thought about the flyer I had picked up weeks ago from a bulletin board at the diner. Community college. Evening classes. Technical certifications. I had taken it without thinking. Now I was thinking. Not because I believed I was built for more, but because I was starting to understand something that Marcus and the supervisor and my mother all had in common. They had all made a decision about me before I had a chance to show them otherwise, and I was done giving people that much time. The next morning, I went to the campus before my shift. I signed up for everything I could afford. I did not celebrate. I did not call anyone. I added it to the list of things I had to survive. And somewhere underneath all of it, quiet and steady, the thought stayed, I do not get to fail. Not here. Not when failing means they were right. 2 years passed the way time passes when you do not have enough of it to notice it going. I finished the technical program on Thursday evening. No one was sitting in the audience for me. No dinner after. I drove home, changed my clothes, and woke up early the next morning for the 5 o'clock diner shift. But something had changed. I knew what I was doing now. Not everything. Not enough to feel confident. But enough to look at a system and see where it would fail before it actually did. That was when I started building the proposal. Debt was a deadline, and the first time I tried to turn what I had learned into something real, I walked into a conference room with a proposal I had spent 6 weeks building and walked out 11 minutes later with nothing. The manager who spoke first used the word interesting. I had learned by then that interesting was what people said when they had already decided no, but did not want to explain why. It is not something we are looking to implement right now, he said. Another man nodded without looking up from his phone. We have systems in place. I gathered my papers, nodded like I understood, walked out. Sat in my car in the parking garage for 20 minutes without starting the engine. Not crying, not angry, just sitting with the specific weight of a door closing quietly. Her voice came back the way it always did in the spaces where nothing else filled them. Not what we needed. She had said that at dinner once, the kind of dinner where everything was arranged just right, wine glasses full, her voice warm the way it got when she was performing generosity for an audience. She had been talking about a plant she had tried to grow once, something that had not taken no matter what she did. Some things just do not adapt, she had said. And then she had glanced at me, the way she did when she wanted to make a point without having to claim it. I started the engine, because even if the room had been right about the proposal, it was not right about me. 3 weeks later, a man named Dwight called. He had a small operation, electrical systems for commercial spaces, nothing glamorous. He had heard about the proposal the same way things travel in industries like that, through someone who mentioned it to someone who mentioned it to him. He did not have a big budget. He did not need anything complex. He just needed something that worked, and he was willing to let someone who believed in it prove that it did. We met in his office, which was the kind of space that told you everything about how he operated. Papers in stacks that were messy but not random. Old equipment that still functioned. A coffee maker that had been there a long time and was going to stay there a long time more. He asked 3 questions. What does it do? What does it cost? How long will it take? I answered each one directly. He nodded once, slowly, like he was confirming something he had already suspected. Let us try it, he said. That was it. No committee, no delay, no one checking with someone else down the hall, just a decision made by a person who trusted his own judgment enough to act on it. I handled everything myself. Planning, materials, installation, testing. There was no one to hand things off to, no one to catch a mistake if I made one. Every wire, Every connection, every system check was mine. There were moments I stood in that cramped utility room, staring at what I had built, wondering if I had miscalculated something I would not find until it was too late. But I kept going. When it powered on without errors, Dwight looked at the readout, then at me. "This works," he said. He paid me on the spot, not a large amount, but it was the first money I had earned from something entirely mine. Not a shift, not a task assigned by someone else. Something I had conceived, built, and delivered. I sat in my car afterward holding the check, and for a moment the number on it did not matter. What mattered was that it existed, that I had made it exist. 3 months after I started taking on my own contracts, I found something I was not looking for. I was going through paperwork for a new account, cross-referencing old records the way I had learned to do, when I saw a credit inquiry attached to my name. The date was from years earlier. 2012. A card application, my name, my information, an address I recognized, my parents' house. I stared at it for a long time. I was 17 in 2012. I had no credit history, no income worth reporting, no reason to apply for anything. I set the paper down, picked it up again. Read it one more time, slowly. The way you read something when you are hoping the words will rearrange themselves into something that makes more sense. They did not. I picked up the phone and called the credit bureau. The representative was polite and efficient. She confirmed the inquiry, confirmed the address, confirmed that an application had been submitted and denied because the information provided had not been consistent enough to process. I thanked her. Hung up. Sat without moving for a while. Outside, traffic moved past the window the way it always did, indifferent, continuous, completely unaware that something had just shifted in a small office with bad lighting and a coffee maker that needed to be replaced. I thought about calling her. Not to confront, not yet. I thought about the sound of her voice on the phone, the way it would shift when she realized what I was asking about, the way she would manage it, reframe it, turn my question into evidence of my own instability. "She is always like this," she would say to my father afterward. Making accusations, creating drama. "You know how she gets." I had heard that sentence, or versions of it, my entire childhood, so I did not call. Instead, I opened a folder on my desk. I printed the inquiry record. I placed it inside. Then I went back to work. Not because I had let it go, because I had learned something in that warehouse, watching Marcus redirect blame with 8 quiet words, watching the supervisor accept the easiest available explanation without checking it. Confrontation only works when the other person is willing to be honest. And the people who use your name without asking do not become honest when challenged. They become strategic. So I was going to be more strategic. I kept records. Every document I could find. Every inconsistency. Every date, every account, every number that did not line up the way it should have. Not to use immediately, just to have. Because I had learned that in every room where blame moves easily, the person who wins is not the one who is right. It is the one who can prove it. The folder stayed in my desk drawer for 11 months. I did not touch it often, just knew it was there. The same way you know where the emergency exit is in a building you work in every day. Not because you expect to need it, but because knowing changes how you move through the space. The contracts kept coming. Slowly at first, then with more regularity. Dwight sent 2 referrals. One of those sent another. The work was not glamorous, but it was consistent. And consistent was the thing I had been chasing since the night I climbed out that window with $83 in a backpack. I hired 1 person, then 2, moved out of the car and into a small office that smelled like old carpet and possibility. Upgraded the coffee maker, kept the same hours. That was the part nobody saw from the outside. That the version of me that showed up in the Forbes email had been built in parking lots and diner shifts and 11-month folders sitting in desk drawers. The email came on a Tuesday morning in early spring. I was already at my desk when it arrived, going over a project timeline that had slipped by 2 days. My coffee had gone cold. My phone was on silent. The subject line said, "Congratulations." I almost deleted it. Not because I thought it was spam, because I had trained myself to focus on what was immediately in front of me, and congratulations did not sound like something that required my attention before 7 in the morning. But something made me pause. I opened it. It took a second to understand what I was reading, another second to believe it. Forbes, 30 under 30, my name. I read it again, then again. Not because I was excited, because I was looking for the mistake. The part where they had meant someone else, some other Sienna Hale who had come from somewhere cleaner and arrived somewhere more obvious. But there was no mistake. The details matched. The work matched. The company I had built piece by piece was right there, described in a way that made it sound larger and more inevitable than it had ever felt from the inside. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen. The room was quiet. Same desk, same unfinished work, same cold coffee, but something had shifted, externally, officially. A memory surfaced without warning, the way her voice always did when I let my guard down. Worthless piece of trash. It did not come back loudly, it did not shake me. It just settled there, quietly, next to the words on the screen. I sat with both things for a moment. The version of me she had described at that dinner table, holding a tray, pretending not to feel the room laughing. And the version sitting here now, in an office that existed because I had refused to let that description be the final one. Then I closed the email, not because it did not matter, because I needed to finish the timeline before the 9 o'clock call. Around midday, Lila knocked on my door. She had started 6 months earlier, young, sharp, still figuring out which questions were worth asking out loud. She reminded me of myself, not in circumstance, but in the way she watched everything carefully before she moved, like she was trying to understand the rules of a room before committing to them. She held up her phone. "Is this you?" she asked. My name. On a different site now. Shared, reposted, already moving. "Yeah," I said, "that is me." Her eyes did something I was not used to seeing directed at me. "That is huge," she said. "You did not say anything. I just found out this morning." She stepped fully into the room. "Did you always know you would get here?" That question landed differently than she intended it to. "No," I said. "Then who did?" I thought about answering that honestly. "No one believed in me before I did," I said instead, close enough to the truth, but not the whole truth. The whole truth was that the people who were supposed to believe in me had made a different decision a long time ago, and I had spent years building something in the space their certainty had left behind. Lila nodded slowly. "That makes it even more impressive," she said. I did not respond. Because impressive implied something clean, something that could be packaged and posted and pointed at, and there was nothing clean about sleeping in a car, about being blamed for pallets that were never yours, about finding a credit inquiry with your name on it from an address you had not lived at in years. It was just what happened when the alternative was proving them right. She left. The door closed softly. I opened my email again. More messages. People I had worked with, names I did not recognize. And one that stood out. A stranger who had seen the article, looked into the work, and ended it with 2 words. "Keep going." I read it twice. Because it was the opposite of everything I had grown up hearing. No comparison, no condition, no expectation attached, just forward. I was still at my desk at 8 that evening when my phone lit up. Unknown number. I watched it ring. 4 times. 5. Then it stopped. A minute later, the notification appeared. 1 new voicemail. I did not play it. Not yet. Instead, I opened my email and looked at the Forbes article one more time, at my name in that list, at the company description that said nothing about parking lots or diner shifts or folders in desk drawers. Then I opened a new message and typed the address I had not used in 9 years. I did not write anything. I just let the cursor blink in the subject line for a moment. Then I closed it without sending, because I already knew what was in that voicemail, and I was going to need to be ready before I decided what to do with it. I picked up the folder from my drawer, set it on the desk, and went back to work. 3 days after the Forbes article went live, the first message arrived. It landed in my business inbox, not my personal one, which told me everything I needed to know about how they found me. The subject line was just my full name, no greeting, no context, just Sienna Hale. I stared at it longer than I should have. Not because I did not know who it was from, Because I did. There are some names that do not need to be written out for you to recognize them. I opened it. The message was short. It is your mom. We saw your name online. We need to talk. It is important. No apology, no acknowledgement of time, just need. I leaned back in my chair and let the silence stretch. 9 years. Not a single call. Not a single message. And the first thing she said was, we need. I closed the email without responding. Not out of anger. Out of clarity. That night, I worked late. Later than I needed to. Going over numbers that did not require that much attention. Checking details that were already correct. It was easier than thinking. Easier than deciding what to do with something I had spent years not having to deal with. When I finally got home, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I let it ring, then stop. Then a notification. Voicemail. I sat on the edge of my couch for a second before opening it. Her voice filled the room immediately. Familiar, unchanged. Sienna, it is your mom. I know you saw my message. Call me back. This is important. The tone was different from the email, more urgent, but not softer, not kind, just pressing. I deleted it, not because I did not want to hear it, because I had already heard everything I needed. The next morning, I almost convinced myself that was the end of it. That they had reached out, I had not responded, and it would fade back into nothing. I should have known better. It was late afternoon when the doorbell rang, not once, but repeatedly, fast, insistent, the kind of ringing that assumes you are inside and refusing to answer. I froze for a second, then stood up slowly. Nobody came to my door like that, not clients, not friends, not anyone who respected boundaries. I walked toward the door, each step steady, controlled. Then I heard her voice, Sienna, I know you were in there. There it was. No hesitation. No doubt. Just certainty. Like she had never lost the right to call my name like that. My hand hovered over the lock. I could ignore it. Let them stand there until they gave up. But something in me wanted to see them. Not out of curiosity. Out of something closer to closure. I unlocked the door and opened it just enough to see them. They looked older. That was the first thing I noticed. Not dramatically. Not enough to shock. But enough that time had left marks. My mom's face was tighter, lines around her mouth deeper than I remembered. My dad's shoulders were slightly hunched, like something invisible had settled on him. For a second, none of us spoke. Then my mom stepped forward slightly, her eyes scanning my face. There you are, she said. Not hello, not how are you, just confirmation. I stayed where I was. What do you want? I asked. Her expression flickered, just for a second. Then she recovered. We tried calling you, she said. I did not answer. She let out a small breath like that was an inconvenience. We need to talk, she said. It is important. I nodded once. I saw your message. Then why did you not respond? She asked. The question came out sharp, like I had done something wrong. And for a moment, I felt that old instinct rise up. The need to explain. To justify. To smooth things over. I pushed it down. Because I did not owe her that anymore. I was busy, I said. Her lips pressed together. That was not the answer she expected, or accepted. She looked past me, trying to see into the apartment. We should not be talking about this out here, she said. Let us come in. I did not move. No, I said. Her eyes snapped back to mine. Excuse me, she said. You can tell me what you want from here, I said. My dad shifted beside her, finally speaking. Sienna, he said, his voice quieter than I remembered. We really need to sit down for this. I studied him for a second. He looked tired, more than I had ever seen him. But that did not change anything. You can say it here, I repeated. My mom's patience thinned. This is not appropriate, she said, glancing around like the hallway itself was judging her. Then she looked back at me and something slipped. A tone I recognized instantly. You were still being difficult, she said. There it was, layer 1, unchanged. The same voice, the same assumption, that I was the problem, that I needed correcting. For a second, I almost smiled, because she had not even adjusted. Not yet. Not until she needed to. I stepped back slightly, opening the door just enough for them to see inside. Not inviting, just enough. Her eyes moved quickly. The space, the furniture, the details. She took it all in within seconds. And I watched the exact moment it hit her. This was not what she expected. Not a small, temporary space. Not something she could dismiss. My dad noticed it too. His gaze lingered a little longer, quieter, more careful. Something changed in the air, subtle, but real. Layer 2, her posture shifted. Her expression softened just a fraction. "You have done well," she said. The words felt foreign coming from her. Not because they were kind, because they were calculated. I did not respond. She stepped forward again, this time slower. "We saw your name," she continued. "The article. You should have told us." That almost made me laugh. Should have. Like we had been in contact. Like there had been a conversation to interrupt. I waited. Because I knew there was more. There always was. My dad cleared his throat. "Things have been difficult," he said. I kept my eyes on him. "What kind of difficult?" I asked. He hesitated. My mom did not. "Your brother is going through something," she said quickly. "His business. There have been setbacks." Of course there had. I felt no surprise, only confirmation. "And you came here for me," I said. Not a question, a statement. She did not deny it. "We need help," she said. There it was. The reason. The real one. Clear. Direct. My dad stepped in again, trying to soften it. "We are working with the bank," he said. "There is a restructuring option, but they need someone with a stable income, good credit, someone they can trust." His eyes met mine. "You," the word hung there without being spoken. I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You want me to sign?" I said. My mom nodded quickly. "Just to support the application," she said. "It is temporary, until things stabilize. Temporary." I let that word sit for a moment, the same way I had let her words sit years ago. Temporary was never temporary, not in situations like this, not when the foundation was already cracked. "What happens if it does not stabilize?" I asked. My dad looked away. My mom did not. "It will," she said. That was not an answer. That was hope. And hope was not something banks accepted. I studied her face, looking for something. Anything. A trace of regret. An acknowledgement. But there was none. Only urgency. Only need. And underneath it, something else. Expectation. Because in her mind, this still worked the same way it always had. Family meant obligation. It meant stepping in when called. It meant not asking too many questions. I took a slow breath. "You took everything I had," I said. Her expression tightened. "That was different," she said quickly. "That was a family decision." Of course it was. Everything had always been a family decision, just never one I was included in. "And now you need me," I said. My dad stepped forward slightly. "We are asking for help," he said. That is what families do. There it was. The line. The one that had been waiting. I felt something settle inside me. Not anger, not resentment, something steadier, clearer. "You mean that is what I am supposed to do?" I said. Neither of them answered. They did not have to. I already knew. I looked at them for another moment. Then I stepped back and opened the door wider. 10 minutes, I said. They both blinked. "You can come in for 10 minutes, no more." My mom hesitated, then nodded. "Of course," she said. "We just need to talk." I turned and walked inside without waiting for them to follow, because for the first time in my life they were entering my space, not the other way around. I heard their footsteps behind me, slower than I remembered, more careful, like they were stepping into a place they were not sure they belonged. Good. They did not. I stopped near the kitchen and gestured toward the small table. "Sit," I said. My mom looked around again before sitting down, taking in every detail like she was trying to measure it against something in her head. My dad followed, quieter, his hands resting on the table like he did not know where else to put them. I stayed standing for a moment, then pulled out a chair and sat across from them. 10 minutes, I repeated. My mom nodded quickly. "We will be quick," she said. I did not respond, because we both knew that was not true. There was too much here. Too many years. Too much that had never been said. My dad cleared his throat. "We already explained the situation," he said. "Your brother needs help. The bank is giving us a chance to restructure, but we need your support." I leaned back slightly, watching him. "You need my name," I said. He hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." I let a few seconds pass, just long enough to make them feel it. Then I reached over to the stack of folders I had already pulled out before opening the door, because I knew this was coming. I slid one across the table. "Start there," I said. My mom frowned slightly, then opened it. Her eyes moved quickly across the page, then stopped. Her hands stilled. "What is this?" she asked. "You know exactly what it is," I said. "The withdrawal record from my college account. The one that went to zero right before I checked it." Her lips parted slightly. My dad leaned over, looking at the paper. His jaw tightened. "We meant to explain that," he said. "You did not," I replied. My mom straightened. "That was for your brother," she said quickly. "He was in trouble. He needed support." I nodded once, and I did not. Her expression flickered. "That is not what I said," she replied. "It is exactly what you said," I said, just without the words. My dad shifted in his chair. "We were under pressure," he said. "We had to make decisions. For the family." There it was again. Family. Always used when it benefited them, never when it cost me. I tapped the paper lightly. "That was my future," I said. "You took it without telling me." My mom's voice sharpened. "You were not even using it," she said. "You had no clear direction. We could not just let that money sit there while your brother was struggling." The words landed exactly how she intended. Practical, justified, clean, like it had been a logical choice. I felt something rise in my chest. Not anger, something colder. "You decided I was not worth investing in," I said. Her eyes narrowed. "That is not fair," she replied. "You are twisting things." I almost smiled, because that was always the next step. If I said something true, I would twist it. I reached for another folder. "Let us keep going," I said. I slid the next set of papers toward them. My dad picked it up this time. His brows pulled together as he read. "This is not right," he said. "It is exactly right," I replied. "Credit application. My name. My information. A date from years ago. A location I had not been in." My mom leaned in, reading over his shoulder. Her face went pale for a second, then hardened. "We do not know anything about that," she said quickly. Of course she did. The reaction gave it away. "You tried to open a card in my name," I said. "That is serious," my dad said, his voice tighter now. "We would never do that." I held his gaze. "Then how did it happen?" I asked. He did not answer. Because there was no answer that did not lead back to them. My mom shook her head. "This is ridiculous," she said. "You are bringing up old things that have nothing to do with why we are here." I let that sit, then leaned forward slightly. "It has everything to do with why you are here," I said. "Because you did not just take from me once, you kept talking. Every time you needed something." Her eyes flashed. "We raised you," she said. "We gave you everything." There it was, the trade. Everything they had done turned into a debt I was supposed to repay. I nodded slowly. "You gave me a place to live," I said. "And then you reminded me every day that I did not belong there." My dad looked down at the table. My mom did not. "That is not true," she said. I let out a small breath. Then I said it. The thing I had not said out loud in years. "You called me a worthless piece of trash in front of people," I said. The room went quiet. My mom's expression shifted, just slightly. Like she had not expected me to say it directly. "That was a joke," she said. "It was not a joke," I replied. "People laughed," she said. "Exactly," I said. My dad rubbed his forehead, like this was becoming inconvenient. "We are not here to go over the past," he said. "We are here because we need help now." Of course he was. Because the past only mattered when it served them. I reached for the last folder. Then I stopped. Because this one was not paper. It was a memory. "You told people I ran away," I said. My mom blinked. "What are you talking about?" I leaned back, watching her. "Church. Neighbors. Your friends. You told them I left with someone. That I abandoned you." Her silence lasted too long. Then she exhaled. "We had to explain something," she said. "We could not just tell people you left in the middle of the night. That would have raised questions. So you lied," I said. "We protected the family," she corrected. I let that settle. Because that was the truth, not about me, about them, their image, their reputation, everything that mattered more than what was real. My dad spoke again, quieter now. "We did not expect you to disappear like that," he said. "We thought you would come back." Of course they did, because in their version of the story, I always came back. I always adjusted. I always accepted whatever they decided. But I did not, and that was the part they never accounted for. I looked at both of them, really looked. At the people who had shaped so much of what I had become. And for a second, I heard it again. Worthless, soft, familiar, still there. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, then opened them again. Clear, steady, you used me, I said. The words landed heavier than anything else. Not loud, not dramatic, just true. My mom's face tightened. That is not fair, she said again. Nothing about this was fair, I replied. My dad leaned forward. We are here now, he said. We are asking for help. Can you just focus on that? I studied him for a second, then nodded slowly. Fine, I said. We will focus on that. Relief flickered across my mom's face. Good, she said. Then you will sign. I held up a hand. No, I said. I will go to the bank meeting. I will listen. I will see exactly what you are asking me to take on. But I am not promising anything. Her relief vanished. We need certainty, she said. You need my name, I replied. That is not the same thing. My dad hesitated, then nodded slowly. That is fair, he said. My mom turned toward him, frustration clear. We do not have time for this, she said. He shook his head slightly. We do not have a choice, he replied. That part, at least, was true. Silence settled over the table again. Heavy, different this time. Not just filled with tension, filled with reality. They stood up a few moments later. My mom smoothed her jacket like she was preparing to step back into a world where everything still made sense. We will send you the details, she said. I nodded once. Do that. My dad paused at the door. Sienna, he said quietly. Thank you. I did not respond. Because I was not doing this for them. I was doing it for myself. For clarity. For closure. They left. The door closed behind them with a soft click. And just like that, the space was mine again. But it did not feel the same. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle. Then I walked back to the table and sat down. My hands rested on the folders, the papers, the proof. Everything that had been buried for years, now out in the open. I stared at it for a long time. Then I reached for my phone, scrolled to a name I had not needed in a while, and pressed call. Tessa picked up on the second ring. Hey, she said, you sound like you have a story. I leaned back in my chair. Yeah, I said. They finally showed up. Tessa was quiet for half a second, which for her meant she was already thinking 3 steps ahead. At your place, she asked. I looked toward the door, still feeling the shape of them in the room, even though they were gone. Yeah, and they want something, she said. Of course they do. I let out a breath that was almost a laugh. A loan, for Grant. There was another pause, shorter this time. Well, that tracks, she said. Do you want legal advice or friend advice first? I leaned my head back against the chair. Both. Good, she said. Legal advice. Do not sign anything. Friend advice. Absolutely do not sign anything. That should have made me smile. It almost did. Instead, I rubbed my hand over my forehead and stared at the stack of papers in front of me. There is more, I said. I told her everything. The college fund, the credit application, the lies they told people after I left. By the time I finished, the room felt smaller somehow, like saying it out loud had made all of it take up physical space. Tessa listened without interrupting, which was one of the reasons I trusted her. When I stopped talking, she said, Have you talked to Grant? The question landed hard. No, I said. You should. I looked at the papers again. Why? Because if they are desperate enough to come to you now, she said, he knows more than they told you. And if he is drowning, he might finally be willing to tell the truth. I hated that she was probably right. The next morning I texted him. I kept it simple. We need to talk. He did not respond for almost 4 hours. Then one message came back. There is a diner off Central and Walnut. 6 o'clock. No hello, no explanation, just a place. By the time I pulled into the parking lot that evening, the sky had turned that dusty blue Texas gets right before dark. The diner looked exactly the way diners like that always do. Old sign out front, too much chrome, windows reflecting traffic and neon. I sat in my car for a minute before going in, not because I was nervous, because I was trying to decide which version of him I was about to meet. The polished son my parents had built their whole world around, or the man beneath all that. Inside, the air smelled like coffee, grease, and something sweet from the pie case near the register. Grant was already there in a back booth. For a second, I almost did not recognize him. He looked older than he should have. Not in his face exactly, but in his posture. Like life had pressed on him in places that no one else could see. His shirt was wrinkled. His hair looked like he had run his hands through it too many times. There was a coffee cup in front of him, half empty, and he had both hands wrapped around it like he needed the heat. He looked up when I approached. "Hey," he said. I slid into the booth across from him. "Do not do that," I said. He blinked. "Do what? Act like we are catching up," I said. "We are not." His mouth tightened. "Fair enough." A waitress came by, asked if I wanted coffee. I nodded, more for something to do than because I wanted it. Grant waited until she walked away. "I heard Mom and Dad went to see you," he said. "Yeah, and they found out I am not sleeping in a car behind a grocery store anymore." That hit him. I saw it in the way his eyes dropped for a second. He knew, then. Or at least he knew enough. "You knew what happened after I left," I said. It was not a question. He looked at me for a long moment, then down at the table. "Some of it," he said. I leaned back. "Some of it." He rubbed his thumb against the coffee cup. "They did not exactly make a habit of telling the truth," he said. "Neither do you," I replied. That got his attention. He looked up fast, something defensive flashing across his face. "You think this was easy for me," he said. I almost laughed then, but there was no humor in it. "Easy for you," I repeated. He leaned forward. "You have no idea what it was like in that house after you left." "No," I said, "I do not, because I was too busy figuring out where to sleep." The waitress dropped off my coffee and walked away fast, sensing what anyone with eyes could have sensed. Neither of us touched our cups. Grant sat back again. "I am not saying you had it easy," he said. "Then do not start with what it was like for you," I said. For a second, neither of us spoke. The clatter of silverware from the kitchen filled the space between us. Somebody at the counter laughed too loudly at something I could not hear. Finally, he nodded once. "Okay," he said. "Fair." I waited. He dragged a hand over his face. "They told people you ran off with some guy." I felt my jaw tighten. "I know." He looked up, surprised. "You know?" I nodded. Mom admitted enough. He stared at the table for a second, then let out a breath. "They told people you were unstable too," he said. "That you had always been difficult. That they tried everything and you just could not be helped." There it was. Not new, but hearing it from him made it uglier somehow. I took a sip of coffee that had already gone lukewarm. "And you sat there," I said. He did not answer. "You let them say it," I continued. "You let them use me as the story that made them look good." His expression hardened. "What did you want me to do, Sienna?" "Tell the truth," I said. He gave a short, bitter laugh. "In that house." "You really think that would have gone well?" My eyes stayed on his. "No," I said. "I think it would have cost you something." That landed. His face shifted just a little. Because that was the part we were finally getting to. He did not speak right away. Then he looked at me and said, "I did not want to be next." The words sat there between us. Simple. Ugly. Honest in the worst possible way. I did not blink. "Next," I repeated. He nodded, slower now. "You were gone," he said. "And after that, I saw it. The way they talked about you when you were not there. The way they turned on you completely because you stopped playing your part." His throat moved when he swallowed. I knew if I pushed back too hard, they would do the same thing to me. Maybe not the same way, but they would. I stared at him. "So you stayed useful," I said. His eyes flickered. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I did. It should have made me furious. In a way, it did. But more than that, it clarified something. He was not a victim. He was a coward who had benefited. There is a difference." I set my coffee cup down carefully. "Did you know about the money?" I asked. He looked away. That was enough to answer enough. "Say it," I said. He exhaled. "Yeah." My chest tightened, not because I was surprised, but because hearing it out loud changed the shape of it. "How much did you know?" He rubbed both hands over his face, then dropped them to the table. "I knew they took it," he said. "I knew where it came from. I told them not to." I watched him without moving. That almost made me laugh too. Almost. "You told them not to," I said. He nodded once, ashamed, but not enough. "They said you would never use it," he said. "That you were drifting, that you would figure something out, that I had a real chance and the family had to protect that." There it was again, the investment logic, the math of worth. And you believed them, I said. At first, he admitted. Then his mouth twisted. Then I needed them to be right. That was the closest thing to honesty I had ever heard from him. Because once that money went into his failure, if they were wrong about me, then all of it had been for nothing. Your business, I said. How bad is it? He laughed without humor and looked out the window. Dead, he said. It has been dead for a while. I just kept pretending it was not. He finally looked back at me. The debts are ugly, Sienna. That part I had assumed. How ugly. He named a number. I did not react outwardly, but inside something went cold. That was not struggling. That was collapsed. And Mom and Dad are trying to cover it. He nodded. They refinanced more than once, pulled from everything they could. And when it still was not enough, they came to you. The waitress passed by again, glanced at us, kept going. I folded my hands on the table. Tell me about the credit application. That changed him. He went still. His eyes met mine for a second, then dropped. You know about that too. I know enough. He reached into the worn leather bag on the seat beside him and pulled out a folder. It looked thin, but used. Opened and closed too many times. He set it on the table, but did not let go right away. I should have given this to you years ago, he said. I did not move to take it. Then why did you not? Because I kept thinking I would handle it, he said. Then I kept thinking maybe it did not matter because it got rejected. Then I kept thinking there was no point reopening everything if you were gone. I looked at the folder, and the truth, I said, is you did not want the mess landing on you. His silence answered for him. Finally, he slid the folder the rest of the way across the table. Inside were copies, application records, partial screenshots, a denial notice, my name, an old address connected to my parents' house, a card application that had been stopped because the information did not line up cleanly enough to go through. I flipped through each page slowly. The room around me faded for a second. All those years I thought I had simply been discarded. No, not discarded, used, even after I was gone. They wanted your credit because mine was already wrecked, Grant said quietly. I kept reading. Did you know before they filed it? I asked. No. Did you know after? He looked me dead in the eye then, and for once he did not dodge. Yes. I closed the folder. That answer should have been enough to make me stand up and walk out. A part of me wanted to. But another part understood that truth had its own value, even when it came from someone too weak to give it earlier. Are you asking me to forgive you? I said. His face changed immediately. No, he said. No. Good. I am telling you because they are worse than you think, he continued, and because if you sign anything for them, they will drag you under and still talk about you like you ruined them. I studied him. That, at least, I believed. He was not trying to save me out of love. He was trying, maybe for the first time in his life, to stand a little closer to the truth than to them. It did not erase anything, but it mattered. I put the papers back in the folder and stood. He looked up fast. That is it, he asked. That is enough, I said. For what? For me to know what I am walking into. He pushed his coffee away. What are you going to do? I picked up the folder. I am going to the bank meeting, I said. His eyes narrowed. You are still considering it. I met his gaze. No, I said. I am considering them hearing no in a room where they cannot rewrite what happened afterward. He stared at me for a second. Then he nodded. That makes sense. I turned to leave. Sienna, he said. I paused, but I did not turn around right away. When I finally did, he looked smaller somehow than he had when I walked in. Not weaker, just stripped down. I was supposed to say something here that matters, he said. Something that explains it. I waited. But there is not one, he finished. No, I said, there is not. Then I walked out and did not look back. The bank meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday at 10 in the morning. I arrived early, not because I was eager, because I wanted a few quiet minutes in that room before they got there, before the performance started, before family became a weapon again. The bank was in one of those polished office buildings that always smell faintly like carpet cleaner and coffee, neutral art on the walls, muted colors, everything designed to make people feel like they were in capable hands while they signed things that could change their lives. I checked in at the front desk and was led to a conference room with glass walls and a long table that looked more expensive than it needed to be. There was a carafe of water in the center, a tray with paper cups, and a window overlooking a parking lot full of cars that all looked like they belonged to people with stable credit and manageable secrets. I set my bag down and took a seat near the middle of the table. Then I waited. A few minutes later, the loan officer walked in. She was about my age, maybe a little older, dressed in a navy suit with the kind of clean, practical look that told me she had seen every kind of financial disaster and no longer wasted energy pretending to be shocked. Her name was Evelyn Brooks. She shook my hand, introduced herself, and sat across from me. "Thank you for coming," she said. I nodded. "Of course." Her eyes moved briefly to the folder in front of me, then back to my face. "You understand why you are here today?" she asked. "I do." She gave a small nod. Professional, contained. Good. The door opened again before either of us said more. My mom walked in first, carrying a handbag too structured for a meeting like this, like she still believed the right shoes and the right posture could solve anything. Dad followed, his expression already worn down, and behind them came Grant. That surprised me. Not because I did not think he would come, but because I had not expected him to walk in with them. My mom saw me and immediately arranged her face into something soft and wounded. "There you are," she said, as if I had been late to a family brunch instead of invited to watch them try to attach me to their debt. Dad gave me a small nod. "Sienna." Grant did not speak. He just took a seat at the far end of the table, not with them exactly, but not fully apart either. Interesting. Evelyn waited until everyone was seated, then opened a file in front of her. "All right," she said. "Thank you all for being here. I know these conversations can be stressful, so I want to be very clear about what today is and what it is not." Her tone was calm, practiced. "Today is a review meeting. We are here to discuss the proposed restructuring of your existing obligations, the financial risk involved, and whether additional support from a co-applicant would materially change the bank's position." My mom nodded too quickly, like she was trying to show she understood the process before the process had even been explained. Dad folded his hands on the table. "The family is stepping up," he said with a glance toward me. There it was, right on time. Evelyn gave him a polite smile that did not encourage him. "Before we talk about that," she said, "I need to summarize where things currently stand." She looked down at her documents. Over the next several minutes, she laid it all out in plain English. The refinanced mortgage, the home equity line, the business-related debt tied to Grant, the missed payments, the penalties, the fact that their debt-to-income ratio had become too unstable to support the terms they were asking for. She spoke without drama, and somehow that made it feel harsher. No raised voice, no judgment, just numbers. Each one a quiet form of truth. My mom kept interrupting with little comments, trying to soften the picture. "We had a difficult year. There were circumstances beyond our control. It is really not as bad as it sounds." Evelyn listened and then kept going. By the time she finished, the room felt tighter, not emotionally, structurally. Like the walls themselves understood that there was no room left for pretending. Dad cleared his throat. "If Sienna comes on to the loan," he said, "does that resolve the issue?" Evelyn clasped her hands lightly. "It improves the application," she said. "It does not erase the underlying financial risk. It would mean that, if the primary borrowers defaulted, the co-applicant would be fully responsible." My mom turned toward me with that same controlled expression she used to wear when people were watching. "We would never let that happen," she said. I looked at her. "You already did," I said. The room went still for a second. Evelyn looked from me to my parents, then back again. "I am sorry," she said carefully. "Is there a relevant context I should be aware of before we proceed?" My mom jumped in first. "No," she said too quickly. "This is just emotional history. Families have disagreements. Sienna has always been very sensitive. The old script, the old reduction, difficult, sensitive, too much." I felt it flicker through me, that old instinct to shrink, to defend, to start explaining myself in ways that made other people comfortable. Then I looked down at the folder in front of me, at the papers I had carried in, at the years folded into them, and I did not shrink. "Actually, there is context," I said. Mom made a small sound of protest. Sienna, this is not the time. It is exactly the time, I said. I opened the folder and slid the first set of papers toward Evelyn. She took them, brows drawing together as she scanned the top page. This is a withdrawal record, she said. From my college fund, I replied. From the year I left home. The account was emptied without my knowledge and used to support my brother's failing business. Mom's face tightened immediately. That is a gross mischaracterization, she said. It was a family decision made during a crisis. I looked at her. A family decision I was not told about, I said. Dad spoke without looking at me. We intended to explain it. No, I said. You intended for me not to notice. Evelyn kept reading. The room was quiet except for the soft movement of paper. Then she looked up. Is this accurate? Mom sat straighter. It was money we had control over, she said. Our son was in trouble. We did what we had to do. I almost admired the nerve of it. Not because it was convincing, because it was so completely untouched by shame. I slid the second set of papers across the table. There is more, I said. Evelyn took them. Her expression changed again, this time more sharply. This appears to be a credit application, she said slowly. In my name, I replied. Submitted years after I left. It did not go through because the information did not line up cleanly enough. Mom actually laughed, a brittle little sound. That is ridiculous, she said. Anyone could have done that. Grant moved then for the first time, not much, just enough to pull attention toward him. It was them, he said. The room shifted. Dad turned his head sharply. Grant. He did not look at Dad. He looked at Evelyn. I saw the documents after, he said. They were trying to get another line of credit because mine was already bad. They used her information. Mom stared at him like she could stop him if she looked hard enough. You do not know what you are talking about, she snapped. Grant let out a tired breath. I know exactly what I am talking about. Evelyn set the papers down very carefully. Ms. Hale, she said to me, did you ever authorize this application? No. Did you report it? No, I said. I found out much later. By then, it had already been denied. She gave a small nod, but I could see the concern in the set of her mouth. I reached for the last section of the folder. This part is not financial, I said, but it matters. Mom's whole body tensed. Sienna, enough. I ignored her and slid the papers toward Evelyn. They were printouts of old messages, community bulletins, and notes I had pieced together after talking to Grant and going back through what I could find. Nothing as clean as a bank record, but enough to outline the pattern. After I left, I said, my parents told people I ran off with a man, that I was unstable, that they had tried everything, and I abandoned them. They turned my leaving into a story that protected them socially. Evelyn looked confused for half a second, then careful again. I understand that there is family history here, she said, but I need to stay focused on the lending risk. You should, I said, because this is the lending risk. I leaned forward, my voice calm. These are people who took my education fund without telling me, attempted to use my identity for credit, and have spent years rewriting the truth whenever the truth made them look bad. And now they want me to attach my name and credit to their debt. No one spoke. Outside the glass wall, a man in a gray suit walked past carrying a coffee and did not glance in. Inside that room, the air felt different, cleaner, because for the first time, the truth was sitting out in the open without needing anyone's permission. Dad tried next. Whatever mistakes were made, he said, we are still family. There it was again, that word, worn smooth from overuse. I turned toward him. Family did not stop you from taking from me, I said. Mom's eyes filled suddenly, almost on command. Oh, for heaven's sake, she said. We are not perfect people. We made choices. But if we lose the house over this, people will talk. We will be humiliated. And there it was. Not regret. Not accountability. Humiliation. That was the pain she could name. That was the wound she cared about. I felt something inside me go still. I saw her as clearly as I had ever seen her. Not as my mother. As a woman terrified of losing control of the version of herself she had sold to the world. You are not afraid of losing the house, I said quietly. Her head snapped toward me. What? You are afraid of losing the story, I said. No one moved. You are afraid people will find out you were never the family you pretended to be. You are afraid they will see what you did and who you did it to. Her face changed. The tears did not stop, but something harder came through them. How dare you, she whispered. I almost laughed at that too. After everything, that was still her question. How dare I? Evelyn cleared her throat softly. Given the information that has been shared, she said, I want to be very direct. Ms. Mizzen, Hale, if you join this loan, you would be taking on significant financial exposure in support of applicants who already present serious repayment concerns. In light of what I have heard today, I would advise extreme caution. Extreme caution. Professional language for do not do this. I looked down at my hands for a moment, and that was when the hesitation came. Real hesitation. Not because I thought I should save them. Because there is something about sitting across from the people who raised you, even badly, even cruelly, and knowing your next sentence will change the rest of their lives. I thought about the house, the one on the quiet street in Plano, the dinners, the polished table, the sound of laughter when my mother called me trash. I thought about the car I had slept in, the loans, the jobs, the years it took to build a life no one handed me. I thought about all the nights I had heard her voice in my head and kept going anyway. Worthless, not what we needed, family mistake. Then I looked up. No, I said. The word came out steady, small, absolute. Dad's shoulders dropped like the sound of it had weight. Mom stared at me in disbelief. Sienna, she said, as if I had misunderstood the question. I will not sign, I said. Grant closed his eyes briefly. Dad rubbed his hand over his mouth and looked down at the table. Mom leaned toward me, desperation cracking through the performance at last. Please, she said, we are your parents. Being my parents did not stop you from using me, I replied. She flinched. Evelyn folded her hands. Without a co-applicant, she said, the bank will not approve the restructuring request under the terms presented. Dad's eyes closed for a second. Mom looked at Evelyn like she had just personally betrayed her. There must be something else, she said. There may be counseling resources and hardship planning options, Evelyn replied, but this application, as it stands, cannot move forward. The sentence landed like a door shutting. Quiet, final. No shouting, no spectacle, just the end of their leverage. I gathered my papers slowly, sliding each one back into the folder. Mom was still talking, but now it sounded distant. Something about unfairness, about stress, about how children owed their parents some measure of loyalty. I stood. Grant stood too, but stayed back. Dad did not look at me. I picked up my bag and tucked the folder under my arm. No one stopped me. No one could. At the door, I turned once, not because I had anything left to say, because I wanted to see it. The moment they understood they were not in control anymore. Then I walked out, leaving them in that room with the numbers, the truth, and the life they had built for themselves. I did not feel triumphant in the elevator down. I did not feel vindicated in the parking garage either. What I felt was quieter than that, lighter maybe, not because anything had been fixed, because something had finally ended. For years, I had lived with the shape of them inside me. Mom's voice, sharp and polished. Dad's silence, heavy and useful. Grant sitting there at the center of everything like he had been born into light while I learned how to survive in the shadows around him. But when those bank doors closed behind me that afternoon, something shifted. They were still who they were. I was just no longer standing inside the version of me they had built. The fallout came fast. Not all at once, and not dramatically in the way people imagine karma should arrive, with sirens and spectacle and some perfect public scene. Real consequences almost never look like that. They come in phone calls not returned, in letters no one can delay, in doors that stop opening. About 3 weeks after the meeting, Tessa called me during lunch. It is done, she said. I knew what she meant before she explained it. The foreclosure process had moved forward. There had been no miracle refinance, no private rescue from some friend at church, no quiet solution tucked away by one of Dad's old contacts. The house in Plano was no longer theirs to save. I stood at the counter in my office kitchen with a sandwich in one hand and my phone in the other, staring out the window at nothing. Okay, I said. Tessa was quiet for a second. You sound calm, she said. I looked down at the untouched sandwich, then set it on the counter. I am calm, I said. That was the truth. Not because it did not matter. Because it did. It just did not belong to me anymore. They moved 2 months later. I did not help. I did not drive by while the truck was there. I did not call. Grant did, though. Not to ask for anything. Just to tell me. He left a voicemail I listened to once while I was sitting in traffic on the way back from a site visit in Arlington. They are out of the house, he said. Apartment in Richardson, smaller place. Mom hates it. Dad is barely talking. I figured you should know. That was all. No pressure, no appeal, just information. I deleted the message and kept driving. Still, a few weeks after that, I found myself taking the long way home one evening, and without really deciding to, I ended up near the old neighborhood. Plano looked exactly the way it always had. Neat lawns, pale stone entry signs, curving streets with names meant to sound more expensive than they were. For a second, I considered turning around. Instead, I drove in. The house was not empty anymore. There was a different car in the driveway, potted plants by the front steps. A wind chime hung near the porch that had never been there when we lived in it. I parked across the street and sat there with the engine running. I expected something to happen inside me, grief, maybe, or rage, or some sharp ache for the girl who had climbed out that window with a backpack and $83. But what I felt was stranger than all of that. Distance. That house had once held so much power over me. It had shaped the way I saw myself, what I expected from people, how quickly I apologized for taking up space. Now it was just the house, with somebody else's flower pots on the porch. I sat there for another minute, then drove away. That became the pattern of the next year. News would reach me through other people, through silence, through the gaps where my parents used to think influence could protect them. Dad retired earlier than he meant to. Not officially because of the house. Not officially because of the money. Not officially because a financial advisor who could not keep his own life from collapsing tends to lose a certain kind of credibility. But that was the reason anyway. He disappeared into himself after that, according to Grant. Less church, less golf, less pretending. Mom handled it differently. She fought reality as long as she could. She made excuses. She told people the move was temporary, then strategic, then somehow better for their stage of life. But communities like the one she had spent years impressing are excellent at one thing above all else. They notice, not loudly, not to your face, but they notice. The invitations slowed down. The calls became less frequent. Women who used to linger after church to compliment her outfit or ask her opinion on a fundraiser suddenly had somewhere else to be. It was not a scandal exactly. Nothing dramatic enough for that. Just that subtle social cooling that happens when the image cracks and everybody sees the outline of the truth. Grant ended up carrying more than I expected. Not nobly, not heroically, just practically. He sold what was left of his business equipment, negotiated what debts he could, took contract work where he found it, and moved through the mess one problem at a time. He did not become a better person overnight. That is not how life works. But something in him had broken too. The illusion, maybe, or the entitlement. He stopped reaching out after a while, except for one brief text on my birthday. Hope you are doing well. I did not answer that either. There was no cruelty in that silence, just a boundary. People who have never had to build themselves from the ground up often misunderstand boundaries. They think it is anger that has not cooled down yet. They think it is punishment or bitterness or pride. It is not. Not when it is real. The real boundary is understanding exactly what contact costs you and deciding the price is too high. By then, my life had grown in ways that no longer left much room for ghosts. The company expanded slowly, then all at once, not in some glamorous overnight success story kind of way, but in the harder, steadier way. More contracts, better systems, more responsibility, fewer mistakes because I had made so many already and learned from each of them. I hired carefully, not just for skill, for character, for people who paid attention, for people who had that same look I used to carry, the one that says, I do not need saving, but I do need a chance. Lila grew fast. By the spring of 2025, she was managing parts of projects I would not have trusted anyone else with a year earlier. She still asked questions, still double-checked things, but there was more certainty in her now. One evening, we were the last two in the office, going over plans for a municipal retrofit project that felt too big until I remembered how many things had once felt too big. She looked up from the spread of papers between us and smiled. "You know what I was thinking today," she said. "That usually worries me," I told her. She laughed. "I was thinking that the first time I met you, I thought you were kind of terrifying." I raised an eyebrow. "Kind of." She leaned back in her chair. "You were so calm all the time, like nothing rattled you." That almost made me laugh. "Everything rattled me," I said. "I just learned how not to show it." She looked at me for a second, then nodded. "That makes more sense." There was a pause. Then she asked the question differently this time. "Who taught you that?" I knew what she meant. Not systems, not business. How to hold yourself together when nobody has built safety around you. I thought about lying, giving her something simple. Work taught me, time taught me, life taught me. But she deserved better than that. Pain, I said, and practice. Her expression softened, but she did not push. That was one of the things I appreciated about her. She knew when a door had opened enough. Later that year, I started a mentorship program through the company, small at first. Paid training, real hours. Entry points for young people who had skill and grit but no polished network to carry them into a room. Most of them did not need speeches. They needed clarity, consistency, and someone who was not looking at them like a gamble. Watching them learn did something unexpected to me. It gave shape to all the years I had spent trying to prove I was not what my family said I was, not because I saw myself in every one of them, because I did not want anyone else to mistake cruelty for truth. The voicemail from Mom came in late that fall. I was at home, shoes off, laptop open, half reading a proposal and half listening to rain hit the windows. Unknown number. I let it ring. Then the notification. One new voicemail. I knew before I pressed play. "Sienna," she said. And even now I could hear the strain of trying to sound composed. "I know things are not perfect, but I hope one day you will understand we did what we thought was best. I would like to talk if you are ready." I listened all the way through. Then I set the phone down on the coffee table and stared at it. That was the closest she would ever come to an apology. Not because she could not say more, because saying more would require seeing herself clearly, and I do not think she ever learned how to do that. I did not call back. I did not need to. Some conversations are not unfinished. They are complete in the absence of what should have been said. A few months later, I saw Dad from a distance, completely by accident. I was leaving a hardware supplier outside Addison when he stepped out of the shop next door carrying a small paper bag and wearing a jacket I remembered from years ago. He looked thinner, smaller somehow, less like the solid, polished man who used to sit at the head of a table and let the room shape itself around his silence. He did not see me. I sat in my truck and watched him for a moment as he walked across the lot and got into an older sedan I did not recognize. Then I started my engine and drove away. I did not owe him a scene. I did not owe him closure. And maybe most important of all, I did not owe him the comfort of being witnessed by me. That was the final lesson in all of it. Not revenge in the loud cinematic sense. Not humiliation returned for humiliation, just refusal. Refusal to keep participating in the lie. Refusal to hand over my peace because other people were finally facing consequences. Refusal to confuse access with love. For a long time, I thought survival was the whole story. Get out. Stay gone. Build something strong enough that no one could ever push you back into the role they wrote for you. But survival is only the first chapter of freedom. The deeper part comes later. When you realize you do not need to keep proving your worth to the people most committed to misunderstanding it. You just need to stop measuring yourself against what they could not see. That took me longer than leaving, longer than the debt. Longer than the nights in the car, the jobs, the contracts, the silence. But I got there. Not perfectly, not all at once. Still, I got there. And if I had to put the whole thing into one truth, it would be this. I was not the mistake. I was just the one you could not control. If you were in my place, would you have signed or would you have walked away? Let me know in the comment. Thanks for listening to my story.